Thank you so much, Brittany. Thank you so much for your assistance in getting this going. And I know Ronnie's not on here, but Ronnie and I go way back for about 11 years or so. And so I just want to thank Ronnie and DRS for putting this on as well. My name is Bhuttu Mathews. I use he, him pronouns. I am a psychologist based in Vermont right now. But for 25 years, I lived in Chicago and I only moved here in 2016. And I've been living with HIV since 2004. And I came to DRS professionally after getting case management and medical services through Ryan White and assistance from the Howard Brown Health Center, where I got my primary care, and also through with case management through that was done through AIDS Foundation of Chicago. I'm also pretty familiar with peer-led organizations like TPAN, and I had plenty of experience with AFC's Illinois Alliance for Sound AIDS policy, etc. I'll go into all of that later. But the topic of this thing, the entrepreneurial self-actualization, kind of makes me giggle a bit because I would love to find self-actualization. I think we're all just always looking for it. But I'll share what I've learned in my journey, and hopefully it'll help somebody who's watching or listening. I'm going to share my screen here a little bit, if that's okay. So this, I hope everyone can see this. Normally when I do presentations, I ask for a thumbs up or a nod or some kind of a sign that you're watching this. So I'm just hoping that everyone can watch this and see it. A little bit about me. Trying to see if this will actually work here. There we go. I'm a pre-licensed psychologist. I'm working on getting my psychologist license. Vermont is one of the few states in the country that allows someone with a master's degree to practice independently as a psychologist. I practice both at a college clinic as well as in private practice. And I also moonlight at the local crisis counseling clinic that we have here. So I'll often assess people for risk of suicide or homicide, whatever they define as a risk for themselves. So I have about 3 jobs that I do in counseling. Prior to that, I got my master's degree in clinical psychology from St. Michael's College in Vermont. And as I said earlier, I lived in Chicago for almost 25 years, and I got my bachelor's degree in computer science from DePaul University. I've also been avidly involved in rugby and CrossFit and martial arts for many, many years. And one of the things that, the reason I bring that up is I'm vice chair of an organization called International Gay Rugby, which is it's a network of about 90 teams around the world. And as vice chair, I'm responsible for internal affairs, all the internal runnings of the organization. And one of the big things that we're doing now that we're in our 20th year is we're updating our systems to make them more inclusive and more, cognizant of the fact that trans people are playing rugby now. They've always played rugby, but we're making much more of an effort, for example, to protect the rights of trans people playing rugby. World Rugby, our world governing body, apparently has an itch right now to try and ban trans women from playing elite women's rugby and putting up onerous restrictions on the ability of trans men to play rugby. And so we're fighting them head on. And it's got a little bit of a tie into what I'm going to talk about today with entrepreneurship. And that's the reason I brought that up. I'm also a member of ADAPT, a grassroots civil rights organization for the rights of people with disabilities. It has chapters around the country, and some would say it's also influenced similar chapters around the world. And I got my teeth in ADAPT in Chicago with Ronnie and several others like Amber Smock and others. Here I'm connected to Green Mountain ADAPT in Vermont. When I was in Chicago, I was also a member of the AIDS Foundation of Chicago's group, Illinois Alliance for Sound AIDS policy, through which we did a lot of lobbying work and community organizing. And as I mentioned, I'm a former staff member at Access Living, and I got my job there through the employment program at Chicago Housing Social Service Agency. Lene was earlier in the main panel, and I was somebody who was a client of Chicago Housing Social Service Agency. I came to them when I was about to experience homelessness, and I had been a survivor of domestic violence, and I was in recovery, some compulsive behaviors, and so I went through the ringer, and if anything, I just want people to focus on the fact that this is where I am right now. So there's a long history there that I want to sort of go through, but I hope it'll be worth your while. Brittany, if we could please pull up a poll, there's only one person here. And if I could ask that one person who's here, could you tell us if you currently work in services for people living with HIV/AIDS, and where do you find your clients currently living? If so, do they live in urban areas, rural areas, suburban areas? What do you think their demographics are?
You do have the ability to unmute yourself if you have a working microphone, or you can feel free to put that in the chat. Or Bhuttu, if you'd like me, I can go ahead and launch that poll and we'll see if we can get a bite that way too.
Sure, sure. If you've stepped away from your machine, no worries. Oh, thank you for that. So you're like suburban areas, great. Huge part of my work. Thank you so much for this. Huge part of my work was outreach when I was at Chicago, in Chicago, living, working at Access Living. In order to convince people that all of us have the right to live in the environments in which we choose, in as open and least restrictive areas, environments as possible. A huge part of that was that fact that rural people with disabilities had to move to Chicago or to Naperville or to Rockford, to even get a semblance of the kind of services that they needed, and they'd have to leave home because rural areas in Illinois were not accessible for them. When we talk about people with HIV/AIDS, we had so much migration within the state of Illinois towards Chicago because Chicago's services were pretty tight or pretty solid when it came to employment opportunities, Ryan White care, social services and social work and case management with transportation and benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important for us to consider strengthening the state of Illinois' ability to provide these services in suburban and rural areas as well. I currently live in Vermont, which is considered a rural state, and my husband runs an HIV/AIDS service organization here. And part of our work, something that they had a lot of success with was getting a mobile van to provide syringe exchange services. Bringing case management, taking the van to pick up their clients and take them to doctor's appointments, etc. So we have to be inventive and creative in how this happens, right? So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to close that poll here and move on. A little bit about my history, before you'll see here, this is the logo of my counseling clinic. It's called Sundar Ghav. Sundar Ghav is Hindi words, Sundar meaning beautiful and Ghav meaning wounds. It comes from a trauma-informed perspective, the idea that all of us have unique experiences. And for people who are living with HIV/AIDS, we certainly feel a lot of trauma and stigma around our own history and our experiences that we have to reconcile. And a lot of it is unfair. So much of it is unfair that we often get stuck in that muck, and we don't know how to get out of it. Many people living with HIV/AIDS also identify as LGBTQ, and those who are living with HIV/AIDS for a long time. I'm only crossing about 18 years of it right now, but there are people who have been living with it far longer, and aging in place in your own homes, in your own communities, if you choose, with appropriate services in the least restrictive environment as possible. All of these things are really, really important. And when you consider the lifelong experiences of all these people, you're thinking about some significant wounds emotional, psychological, physical even, that we live with. And the idea of my counseling, my own counseling practice is that we can learn to live with that pain. Right now, it might be affecting our day to day and our lives. But as with all grief, the idea is not to overcome the grief, but to learn to live with it as a familiar pain, because grief never really goes away. Pain of such experiences, they just never go away. We learn to live with them as time goes on. That's the key to healthy grief, at least in my opinion. And coming to this, I mentioned that I came to Access Living and Chicago House when I was, about to experience homelessness. In fact, when I started my work at Access Living with Ronnie, I was homeless. I was living at Bonaventure House in Chicago in the Lakeview neighborhood. And, for almost the first year of my work at Access Living, for 10 months, in fact, I was living at Bonaventure House before I moved out into my own apartment. And during that time, I engaged in recovery. I, made sure that I connected myself with my case managers, my AFC provided case managers, my peer education at TPAN. I joined the board at Lexington Brothers while I was still a resident of Bonaventure House, and I continued to be on the board even after I left. And when I moved out into my own apartment, I fought hard to keep what I had. I eventually met my partner the following year in 2011. He happened to be in Chicago for the US Conference on AIDS in November 2011, and I happened to be there for work also. And we met, and now I'm in Vermont. That's a longer story. But I want to go into how entrepreneurial self-realization happens, at least my version of it. First and foremost, I can't really go anywhere without saying how important it is to have appropriate supports, but mostly with peer supports, right? I often used to say in my outreach work that I can talk till I'm blue in the face to a woman who's had a traumatic brain injury about how she should acclimate to life after the TBI. But she's probably more likely going to listen to someone else who's had a TBI, someone who identifies with her identities and her experiences, right? I could talk to some extent on the fact that I belong to the general community of people with disabilities, right? But that person is going to most likely relate to somebody who shares their own life experiences. And I just want to go off on a slight tangent here. Something I often say is, if people ask us why listening to us talk about the experiences of people with disabilities matters, the answer I always give them is, that's the one community we are all guaranteed to join. No matter what our current identities or experiences are, the community of people with disabilities, be it by age, by a medical diagnosis, an accident, doesn't matter. That is the one community each and every one of us are guaranteed to join, right? Those of us who live with HIV/AIDS, tend to belong to a very specific community, but we also belong to a larger community of people with disabilities. And that's the reason people should always pay attention to what we're saying. So at Access Living, I was doing a lot of frontline counseling, counseling people on benefits if they had civil rights issues. And I particularly remember this one case of someone living with HIV/AIDS who told the apartment manager, where she had just gone to see an apartment, hey, yeah, I'm just, I'm just my first real apartment of my own. I'm living at this. She mentioned the name of the place where she was living. And the manager was like, well, what does that place do? And she hesitatingly said, well, it's a place for people with HIV. And this manager was like, oh, sorry, I don't want that stuff going around here. Right? And denied her the apartment. And that's how she came to us. And so we had to take it took a phone call to that person to be like, hey, do you want to come in here and talk to our attorneys about the about disability discrimination? And they were like, oh my God, I didn't realize I'd done that. So stuff like that. Took some counseling at the beginning. Did a lot of community organizing, and Access Living was kind enough to let me do ADAPT community organizing, even though ADAPT is not really an Access Living organization. ADAPT is independent. they were great in allowing me to be surrounded by like-minded people with disabilities. And same thing with the National Council on Independent Living, the formal organization of independent living organizations around the country. It was great for me to be surrounded by people who shared my same life experiences. Until then, I thought it was all about just surrounding myself with people with the same identities. But I learned that it's in the integration of the two that it works the best, right? So I was surrounding myself with people with similar identities as well as similar experiences. And eventually I got around to the idea that, oh, I'm actually enjoying this counseling work a great deal. And this might actually be up my alley, particularly because Access Living was founded. What I didn't realize at the time was the Rogerian idea of people-centered planning, right? Putting the person at the center of your planning and asking them what they want. And if you put the person at the center of what they want of your planning, then you learn what your services need to be, right? And so my counseling is also centered around the person and what they want rather than what I'm doing. There's the old psychological concept of the psychologist is the person who's going to make change happen in your life. And that's pretty much been disowned and repudiated because it's not the psychologist. The psychologist and the counselor are just a partner of the person who comes in the door, right? And it's in that partnership that the magic happens. It's not one person helping another. And that's the basic idea of inclusive design. And, so when I set up my own practice after my studies, it was based on this idea that I'm going to be partnering with whoever comes in through my door. So I'm going to move on here. So if you are thinking of setting up as an entrepreneur, right? The first thing, we want to all talk about is our mission statement, right? We got to talk about the who, what, and why, right? Who are we serving? What are we doing for them? And why are we doing it? So who are your stakeholders that you're going to serve? Remember that not all people living with HIV/AIDS think alike. We don't all act alike. We're not all alike. And much less are the wider community of people with disabilities thinking, acting, and being alike. Then ask yourself, what does each group need? And this is a case where you may have to interview stakeholders, right? You have to interview them and find out what it is that they need. If you're setting up a counseling business, if you're setting up a house cleaning business, if you're setting up a dog walking business, if you're being a personal attendant, you have to interview your clients or your stakeholders and find out what it is they need. That's how you get to refine and clarify what did you do, and then have a clear idea in your head as to why you're doing this, right? Are you on the same page with each other? Do you have a mission statement? Do you revisit that mission statement year after year? And I will share with you my own mission statement here. If I can just find it. I'm going to read it out here, right? Or if you can see it, that's great. Each person experiences distress uniquely, keeping in mind the holistic nature of distress because of the interplay of several factors. And I'm talking about intersectionality here. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'm a gay man. I'm a cis man. I live with HIV and other disabilities. I'm also an athlete. I'm married to someone. I have pets as my children. I have many identities, and my distresses have come as a result of the interplay of many of these factors. Therefore, I'm going to partner with my clients to ensure their safety, to build trust, and to find solutions. And because of my work, I know how important access is. And so my counseling will be accessible and centered around the unconditional acceptance of each person's unique identities and experiences. This is my mission statement, right? And I hope that every time I sit down with a client, this is always going to be at the front of my own cognitions. So I'm going to go back to this. So make sure that you know what your mission is and why you're doing the entrepreneurial work that you're doing. Okay. Something you're going to have to deal with is our systemic attitudes, right? Phobias are usually directed inwards, while prejudice is usually directed outwards towards people. Have a non-discrimination statement and make sure that you address every oppression that you can think of, and ask yourself, are you committed to being against all of those forms of oppression, right? It's not okay to be a gay man who's racist. It's not okay to be a disabled person who is sexist, right? We need to be aware that one form of oppression is not competing with another. Oppression is oppression, and we have to be in this to fight all oppression. We have to be anti-oppression across the board. We have to think about biases. Something that I have to think about often is, are my clients going to resist coming to me or avoid coming to me because they're worried about Medicaid? And so my first thing that I did as a counselor was enroll myself with Vermont Medicaid. In fact, that's the primary group of clients that I go for, that I look to serve. Because of my own life experiences, because of my own professional training, because of my personal beliefs, the first group of people that I look to serve are people with Vermont Medicaid. Right? And remember that biases, can be both positive and negative. Because you choose, because you might like chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream, that's a bias, but that's not a negative bias unless you're really strict about vanilla ice cream. But remember that biases can be both positive and negative. It's about how those biases come out in our lives. Individual attitudes, another speaker was talking about this earlier, but we have to keep in mind trauma. The trauma that people living with HIV and AIDS go through is unique to us, as is all trauma. And that trauma has to be accounted for in the rendering of our services. Burnout, when we serve, and I'm sure a lot of counselors and social workers, first responders, etc., experience this all the time. But when we continuously are stretched to the limit in providing compassion and doing the same work over and over again, and you can easily slap yourself on the head and go, oh, yet another housing situation. And when you've done for 10,000 times already, you're going to have burnout. You're going to have compassion fatigue. Be aware of those things and be aware. Talk to each other. Talk to your counselors. Talk to trusted people in your lives about how you're going to take care of those things when they do pop up. And in fact, be proactive so that when they do pop up, you see the first signs of it rather than seeing the 10,000th time sign of it, by which time it's already affected your health. Your sleep is dysregulated. Your digestive system is out of whack. You're drinking more than you should, your relationships are sour, etc. Right? You want to avoid this long before that stuff happens. Connect with vocational rehabilitation. A huge part of my counseling are centered around the concepts of focusing on controllables as opposed to the uncontrollables, and accepting the uncontrollables, right? We can influence uncontrollables, but we can't control them. And that's a huge part of something that we need to work on individually if we want to achieve that Zen state. I'll open it up for questions at this point, and I'll also leave my contact information up here on the screen while we do questions, if there are any.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free, you can put those in the chat, or if you want to turn your camera on and unmute, we can take questions that way as well. It is a lunch discussion, so if you are in the middle of eating your lunch, we absolutely understand, but we definitely would love to hear from you and continue this conversation. And so we'll give everyone a minute there to kind of gather their thoughts. But Bhuttu, I do want to thank you. You've gotten my wheels turning, and there were so many good quotes that I might have to steal from you there, and things that I didn't even think about myself. The agency that I work for, we're very focused on equity and inclusion and transition when it comes to post-secondary, and we do a lot of work around supporting students with disabilities. And you had mentioned how that is a population that at some point we all could eventually find ourselves being a part of, and that's not something that I had actually thought about before. And then as you mentioned that, I was like, no, you're absolutely right. Whether, like you said, coming with age or an accident or a medical condition, it's all a population that we all eventually will make our way to in some way, shape, or form. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Ronnie and I chuckle about this a great deal, but when I started working at Access Living in 2010, in April of 2010, it was late that fall that Ronnie and our department attended this training at Northwestern University downtown by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky. She was talking about trauma stewardship, the what I just put in the chat. is the title of a book called Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky. And I didn't quite get it, right? Because I'd only been at the job for about 6 months, maybe 5 months at the most, right? And I didn't quite get it. But the next year, early next year, February of 2011, I went to New Orleans with my ex. He'd been living there for many years prior, and he had friends there. So we were staying with his friends and attending Mardi Gras. And here I am in this wonderful, quaint, charming city, and I should be enjoying this beautiful city. But all I could think about was, well, that building's inaccessible, and that building's inaccessible, and children can't use that, and blind people cannot use that. And suddenly I caught myself going, oh, that's what Laura was talking about, right? Our work ingrains, it just gets into our lives, it gets underneath the surface, and then before you know it, our whole worldview is shaped by our work, and we don't even see it happening. And that's what I was referring to, catching the early signs of it happening, because we have to be aware of what those long-term signs are, so we can work backwards and realize, oh, I'm thinking way too much about my clients. I'm not paying attention to my partner or my kids or my pets, and I'm not taking care of my friendships. I'm isolating myself. What's going on? Those are the early signs of burnout and of compassion fatigue and of secondary trauma, right? So yeah, all of us in the human services fields have to be aware of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. We've got a shy group here, but if you have any questions or comments, we'll give it a couple more minutes and see if anyone would like to unmute or type anything in the chat.
I think I mentioned that my dogs, so before the recording started, my dogs have this wonderful sense of timing. And if you heard a bark just now, that is my big one telling the little one to stop bothering him.
Many perks of working from home, either pets or children are sure to make an appearance at some point. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything coming in through the chat, and I don't know that anyone is quite ready to unmute. So unless you have any closing comments.
I'll stop my screen share here at this time. Please, everyone, if you have a chance to come to Vermont, for somebody who grew up in Bombay with 15, 20 million people and then lived in Chicago with 8 million people, coming to 40,000 person Burlington was a huge culture shock, but I've sort of adapted. And I love Vermont. I love New England, especially in the fall. You have a short window of time to come watch the leaves change here. But even if you never thought you'd put a pair of sticks on your feet and slide down a mountain, hey, listen, India here, like if I can ski, you can ski. And there's plenty of adaptive skiing here for people with disabilities. It's a wonderful, wonderful state. Please come visit. And let's if you come and want to let me know what your experience has been, I'll be more than happy to hear it. But thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you so much to Ronnie and DRS and the state of Illinois for hosting this.